Welcome to the Generation Kids Daily Devo podcast, where we move from wonder to worship, looking for God at work in the world around us, ready to ask the tough questions and discover what His Word has to say to us. Today's episode is titled, A Shepherd's Voice, and it comes from me, Casey Taylor. Now, I know that the story is not going to be something that any kids listening to this will have experienced from my same perspective, but it does perfectly illustrate what today's verse is all about. But before we get to the verse, let me tell you my story. When I found out that I was going to be a daddy to my now 14-year-old son, I can remember feeling completely unprepared for the job.
You are not prepared for what's to come.
I was in my early 20s and I'd never been a dad before. And without going into too much detail, I didn't grow up with a dad. So the whole concept of being a dad seemed like something so foreign and unknown to me.
What's going on?
So in preparation for being a dad, I just thought, maybe I'll just be honest with my son and talk to him while he's still in the womb and tell him what I do know. And then just learn along the way how to be a better dad tomorrow than I'd been the day before. Basically, I was committed to learning on the job and picking up any wisdom I could along the way. Now I know babies that are growing inside their moms can't actually understand all that you're saying, but I didn't let that stop me. I would sing songs to my son, showing him some of my favorite artists and their music. I'd make jokes to him that only his mother understood, to make her laugh, but also to try and connect with my boy. I even spent 30 minutes one time explaining all of the rules to playing baseball, because I couldn't get him on the field soon enough, so I wanted to make sure that when he was ready to stand, we could walk to the field together. Not really, but not far off. Then, after 9 months of bacon in the oven of my wife's belly, he finally arrived.
Hello.
And since my wife had to have surgery to help him come out, she couldn't hold him right away. So the doctor brought him over to me right after taking him out and helping him take his first breaths. So many emotions flooded my heart and my mind in that moment. Meeting my son, who I'd never really seen before outside of some pretty weird alien-like photos from some of our doctor's visits. It was so special, but also it felt like I was meeting my son like I'd meet a stranger, because we'd literally never met flesh to flesh. But I could feel our special connection was already there. And in the midst of all of these wild thoughts about the new reality I was in as a father, I started talking to him. Hey, buddy, it's me, your dad. I love you so much, and I'm so glad to get to finally see you. You're amazing. And then the most incredible thing ever happened. From little whimpers as he tried to adjust to life outside of the belly, he stopped whining once he heard my voice. He got quiet. He seemed to perk up. And then he opened his eyes slowly and looked at me straight in the eyes. The doctor had an amazed look on her face and told me, Dad, you're the first thing he's ever seen in his entire life. I lost it. I started crying tears of joy. And I haven't stopped feeling thankful for that moment and for every day getting to be his dad ever since. After reflecting on that time, in the days, weeks, months, and years since, when thinking about this moment, I am reminded of John 10:26 through 27.
But you do not believe because you are not my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me.
My son hadn't seen me with his own eyes. He didn't know what my face looked like. He had never felt my hand hold his. He'd never jumped on my back, yet. He knew my voice, and he knew my voice because we talked. Well, I talked to him, and he listened and learned what my voice sounded like. So much so that in a room full of doctors talking to each other, to my wife and to me, that when my voice filled his ears, it was my voice that stopped his crying and caused him to open his eyes. When we sit with God and listen to His Word, when we read it, study it, memorize it, and then talk about it, we learn what God's voice sounds like. When we learn what our Heavenly Father's voice sounds like, when we hear it, we know it's Him, and our ears, our minds, and our hearts perk up. In our passage, these same Jewish people who had seen Him face to face and watched Him perform miracles and seen His kindness and power on display actually weren't buying that Jesus was the Christ, the one who would come to save them. So they asked Him point blank, Rather than show us all these things, can't you just say it out loud? I am the Christ. And he tells them that they don't believe because they don't recognize his voice, because they aren't his sheep. They aren't those who belong to his flock, who he is guiding and leading, because those sheep hear his voice, recognize it, and follow him. He doesn't need to prove it with miracles. They can hear in his voice that he is who they know him to be. In the same way that my son heard my voice and recognized who I was before I had ever held him, kissed him, or threw him high up in the air, which I promise happened way later. He knew my voice, and so it is with us and God. When we are his, when we have confessed our need for Jesus and asked him to forgive us and accepted his invitation to be in his family as adopted sons and daughters, and begin to listen for his voice, we learn to hear it and to be moved by it, to recognize it in the midst of so many other voices. We know what kinds of things he says, what things he wouldn't say, and we learn to follow where he leads because we are his sheep and we recognize the voice of our shepherd. Now it's time for
Today's Big Question!
Today's big question is, have you ever taken time to just sit and ask God questions and then waited for him, knowing that you could possibly hear something? While God's voice may not be audible or like a normal voice, what do you think you could do to help your heart and your mind be ready to hear from God when he's ready to speak? Talk it over with an older, maybe more experienced Christian and get their thoughts on it. As you learn to hear his voice and as you trust him, I promise you, he will lead you. Thanks for listening to the Generation Kids Daily Devo podcast. If you want to keep in touch with us on all our social media platforms, check out the links in the description. And if you'd like to help support us as we continue to create meaningful content for kids of all generations, please subscribe to our Patreon by visiting us at patreon.com/wearegenerationkids.